we'll get started and then we'll let everyone else join us as they come. All right, that was our wonderful theme song and we're ready to start. All right, so thank you for joining us tonight to Back to Basics, Understanding Your Role as a Board Member. My name is Elise Rosemarin. I'm a Senior Vice President here at ACAM. And joining with me this evening, I have wonderful panelists, Leah Bloomberg, who is a partner at MMPS. I'm not going to say all those names because I will butcher them. And Amanda DeHart-Smith, who is our very own Vice President of Management here at ACAM. Just to give you a little bit about their backgrounds, Leah Bloomberg is a partner at MMPS, and she practices in a real estate group, manages the co-op condo practice there, and she regularly represents in the commercial and residential real estate transaction group and is highly proficient in all aspects of residential real estate ownership. She serves as a general counsel for numerous cooperative corporations and condominium associations. I can't speak today. And she regularly advises boards on various matters, including prospective purchase applications, commercial leases, vendors contracts, financing transactions, you name it, she does it. So thank you so much, Amanda. Well, Leah. I am getting you all confused today already.
Okay.
Thank you, Leah. And Miss Amanda. So Amanda Smith began her career in property management, working for a large national company. And from there, she specialized in management of cooperatives and condominiums. She holds a Bachelor of Science from Medgar Evers College in Brooklyn, New York, as well as an accreditation for the New York Accredited Realty Manager and Certified Property Manager, CPM. Did I say that correctly?
Yes.
That's a big word. All right, well, anyway, she's one of our best and we thank you for joining us. So let's get started. So tonight, our overview is going to be, to discuss board member duties, board member operations, working successfully as a board member, personal liability, and then at the end, we will do a Q&A. And if this is your first time joining us, welcome. And the way we like to do this is we'll have a conversation amongst our panelists, and then please throughout the time, feel free to enter any questions that you have into our Q&A box and we will answer them at the end. And if anything, comes to you at the end of tonight and we don't get to it, please feel free to email either Leah, Amanda, or myself, and we'll get back to you as soon as we can. So let's get this party started. So who would like to discuss this for us? First, the board member duties.
I'll leave that to Leah.
Is Leah? Go for it, Leah.
So essentially, board members have a fiduciary duty to the corporation of which they serve. A fiduciary duty means that instead of acting in what you might think is your own best interest or the interest of your shares, your apartment, your unit, you're acting in the best interest of the corporation as a whole, the condominium association as a whole. So it's sort of separating yourself out from your own personal thoughts and ideals and doing everything with the best interest of the organization, the building in general and as a whole. With that said, you're protected by the business judgment rule, which usually works to assume that board members are working in the best interest of the corporation under which they serve. And that's where your liability protections come in together with insurance, which I know we're going to talk about a bit later. But ultimately, so long as you are working within the confines of what you believe to be the best interest of your building, your fiduciary duty, your liability is rather limited. I'm not going to say entirely limited, but rather limited under the assumption that you are doing everything in the best interest of the organization under which you serve.
That sums it up. I think a lot of the struggle for some of the board members sometimes is separating your personal feeling or your personal circumstance from the decision that needs to be made in the best interest of the building. And so, especially if it comes to things like assessments and finances, right? No one likes to pay more, no one wants to pay more, but often the struggle with the board is, well, we need this money, we need to do this to get this money, but the owners are going to complain, or we don't want to pay more. And we understand that struggle, but what's best for the building always has to supersede, what you may think would be the backlash, or what you feel, in terms of what the end result or outcome would be for you personally, or for some of the other residents in the building. And that's basically what Leah just said in the wonderful attorney words.
I actually think when we're talking about co-ops and condos, it's almost refreshing, right? Because if you take this out of a corporate setting with a company where people aren't necessarily as invested as board members are in their home associations, you get that certain personal touch, which can be beneficial in the sense that Amanda said, we're homeowners in this building. We don't want to have to pay more money, just like everybody else doesn't want to have to pay more money. And so I think it gives that extra personal touch of, hey, what affects you affects us as well. But at the same time, it is thinking on a larger, almost aerial view of, well, what does the building need and what do we need to implement in order to accomplish that?
Just touching upon the officer positions, is there any, fiduciary duty or liability that impacts a particular board position as opposed to others? Is that something that people should consider?
I think before we get into that though, Leah, maybe we should explain to the attendees what the different positions are, and what those responsibilities are, because a lot of people join the boards. They may be first-time home buyers or, first time on a board, and they're not sure what I'm supposed to be doing as a president, or what the president can and cannot do. What should the treasurer be doing? And so I think if we can explain that first, and then we can go into what Elise's question was.
Sure. So I'm going to start by giving a brief overview of each officer and talk to you a little bit about what they're responsible for. But before we do, we'll give our precursor advisory that everything Amanda and I and Elise are going to speak about tonight is on a general scale, broad scope, and typical of most co-ops and condos. That being said, every building is different. Every building's governing documents have twists here and there that might be out of the ordinary or out of the generic form. So consult with counsel, consult with your property management to figure out what it is that your particular building provides. But on a general sense, you usually have a board. Typically it is an odd number so that when it comes to voting, the votes come out a bit easier. And then there's usually certain officers, and the officers typically consist of a president, a vice president, a secretary, and a treasurer. Now there can be assistant treasurer, assistant secretaries. You can have multiple vice presidents. And anyone that doesn't hold an officer position is either a manager on a board of managers for a condo or a director on the board of directors of a co-op. So when you get into the roles of presidents usually run the day-to-day business affairs, general management of the corporation, condominium. They're the ones that typically sign contracts, whether it's construction contracts, service contracts, leases, or other instruments that are authorized by the board. And usually you'll see that with co-ops. They'll typically be the ones to sign proprietary leases and stock certificates when you're transferring over new shares for new apartments. So the president is usually the one that does the day-to-day, and usually the person who's signing on the dotted line for most of these engagements for the association. If the president is unable to be present or sign, they went on vacation, you can't get them, the vice president usually fills in the absence of the president. They usually have the authority to do that, to basically do anything that the president would be able to do if the president were available. Secretaries typically keep minutes and are responsible with serving notices. So annual meetings are typically coming from the secretary. Of course, we know that those that are managed by property managers Property manager usually takes over that kind of role, but it is typically being sent from the secretary. They're also, for co-ops, going to be tasked with affixing the corporate seal to the documents. Again, stock certificates for new transfers, recognition agreements. Again, some of you that might be secretaries might be saying, well, we don't do that. No, management does or council does, but under the general scope of your responsibility, you're the one that would be holding a seal if not for the professionals assisting you. You're also obligated to keep a list of shareholders, their contact information, that kind of stuff. Treasurers are usually care and custody of funds. They're usually going to oversee all the bank statements, all the investments, and make sure that everything is running smoothly, make sure that money is accounted for at all times. They are also tasked with making sure certified financial statements are delivered to all shareholders and unit owners, which again, management can do, but typically is under the definition of what a treasurer might do. And yeah, I think that covers each one of their roles.
Okay.
Thank you. Sorry, to back it up really quick. So is it
Sure.
just to confirm, it's the secretary that in essence takes the minutes?
Yes.
Yes, the secretary of the board is the person who should be taking the minutes. Now, we do understand that if you have a management company, oftentimes the managers may take the minutes or the manager's assistant may join and take the minutes. That's okay. It's common to be done, but it's the secretary of the board's job to take and keep the minutes. There was also a question about, I don't know, are we doing questions as we go?
We're doing questions at the end, but
Okay.
if something
Okay.
pertains, it makes sense to ask in a moment.
Well, since we were on the minutes, someone was asking about including motions and board votes in the minutes. So I was just going to answer. Answer that. Yes, you should be recording any official votes in your minutes. So even if it was a vote that happened via email in between board meetings, you should at your next board meeting record that electronic vote in the minutes. You know, the board voted for such and such, or a motion was made to approve XYZ, motion was seconded, it was approved unanimously or whatever. Some boards like to put the numbers, you know, it was approved 4-3 or something like that. Some boards just like to say, you know, the board voted to approve XYZ. But you should record whatever that vote is in your minutes. While we're talking about officers and their duties, yes, this makes sense to answer. So someone's asking, Leah, being that sometimes it's difficult to get everyone together, what, I'll just read it. Given how difficult and time consuming it can be to consult with all board members and get them to make a decision or vote, how much autonomy, should some of the officers have, say the president or vice president or an executive committee of officers have to make certain day-to-day decisions on behalf of the entire board? Can you give general examples of the types of decisions that would be appropriate for the president or an executive committee to make, given how many management-related issues come up on a weekly or daily basis? Is it just not feasible to bring everything to the entire board and seek full board approval?
So I think when it comes to big ticket items, construction projects, things that affect the entirety of the building in a substantial way, these are obviously things that the board need to meet on, opine on. Obviously, purchase applications are something that the board needs to meet on and opine on. I think the use of email now is making it a lot easier to get more consistent board participation. But in the event that you can't, in other words, I would say, like, if there's an emergency repair that needs to be done and you simply cannot wait for something like that, and management needs to reach out to a board member to get that authority, that would be sort of where the president would step in and say, okay, it's an emergency repair, go do what you need to do. Things that are very time sensitive, and need to be determined immediately, those are the types of things I would say the president would have a more broad scope of being able to authorize, or an executive committee, vice president, if the president is not around. When it comes to more, like I said, more in-depth and more substantial decisions that affect the whole building, that you can wait to circulate an email, and you do have 24, 48 hours to figure out a response. That's where I would try to include the entirety of the board. Usually you just need a majority in order to pass something anyway. So if someone is, not available, but you can get the majority of people to answer, email is a beautiful thing. And so long as it's ratified at the next meeting, you don't have an issue.
Should we get through the rest of the board
Yeah,
members'
please.
these points, and then we can go to
Sure.
the questions about the duties?
Sounds great.
So you talked about duties, the positions, the duties, right? Conflicts of interest, I guess that's next. So a conflict of interest is, for an example, you have a member of the board, and when we say board, I want to clarify. So co-ops are corporations, so your documents may say the corporation, but you're still the board of directors of that corporation.
Correct.
So when we say board, we mean how many ever people that are voted on each year at your annual meeting to run the building. So your governing documents may say, president of the corporation, vice president of the corporation. We're talking about the same thing
They're
here.
one and the same. Yeah,
Correct.
definitely.
Right.
I actually think we had a question on that too.
Yeah, that's why I wanted to clarify before we moved on. So conflict of interest can be, there's a broker who is on the board. This broker sells apartments in the building. There are some buildings who make it a rule just to not have to deal with it,
Yes.
that brokers can't be on the board. Other buildings allow them to be on the board and just recuse that person if an application comes through that they are a party to, or someone from their team is a party to.
Right.
A conflict of interest can also be, you have a project that's going on, one of the board members has a cousin that does that. Whatever, it is, painting or whatever the case is. Or I can just have my cousin, come in and do the work. That can be a conflict of interest. A few years ago, and don't quote me on the year, I want to say it might have been 2018 or 2019, we started being required to report any conflict of interest on an annual basis. So some of you may have gotten this before, a sheet where you have to sign and basically it's saying there were none or there were conflict of interest and explaining what the conflicts were.
Sure.
Of course, if at all possible, you want to try to not put yourself in a position to have a conflict of interest. If for some reason there is one, you are required to report it annually, and something has to be sent out to all of the owners, unit owners or shareholders in your building, saying, yes, we had a conflict, here is what it was, or no, we had no conflicts at all. And I'll give it over to Leah to give us some attorney advice about that.
So conflicts of interest are one of those where I said your liability as a board member is almost entirely protected. Conflicts of interest are where that sort of gets a little dicey. It's extremely important that if you are an interested party, whether you're a broker overseeing a transaction or someone that might be in the construction business that has a company or a subcontractor that wants to bid out a job, that you are entirely removed from that discussion, from that meeting. This can also include things like a board member's apartment was damaged and you're making an insurance claim, and the board is discussing the payout and how they're going to arrange for that settlement with you. These are the types of things that you would need to divorce yourself from. And that's not to say that you don't need to participate in the entirety of that board meeting. You just have to leave for that particular topic. And usually if we know it's coming up, we'll sort of structure the meeting so that, you know, we'll save that last bit till the end so you could be there for the majority of the meeting and then excuse yourself at the end so we can talk about that one topic. I don't think it's any sort of elephant in the room so much as, you know, it's a conflict, so please leave. And typically everybody's pretty good about it. Conversations within the board are to remain within the board and not to be discussed outside of the meeting. So we try to, you know, encourage that as much as possible and remind board members that what you do talk about is confidential, and particularly for these types of conflict cases. And from there, you know, so long as that's happening, you're fine and everything is protected. In the event of someone that is not divorcing themselves from a conflict situation, there could be suggestions of impropriety, of self-dealing. If you're not reporting things on those forms, that's where these things can become problematic for you and your liability then becomes an issue. Those people that are serving on the board just to get that construction contract or to get that leg up on the transaction are obviously not working with the fiduciary duty under the best interests of the building, right? They're doing it more for themselves than they are the entity. And so that's where your liability comes into play, and your insurance coverage might not protect you. But we'll talk about that a bit later.
And in addition to that, though, I want to say that the conflict doesn't only have to be, you know, a broker or a contractor where the board member has an interest or anything like that. A perfect example is I have a building where we have an ongoing leak. It's been going on for a long time. The party that's affected by this leak happens to be on the board. So when we start discussing that particular topic at the board meeting, I say to that specific board member, you know, I'm sorry, please don't be offended, but when we get to this part, you're going to have to excuse yourself because you are a party to this topic. And so you want to be very careful when you have that as well. And so it's not just, you know, that the person is a broker or anything like that. It could be that you have a board member that's a party to a specific topic. You know, they're making the complaint of noise, or there's a complaint against that board member. And so you don't want to include that person in the board discussion. You ask them to recuse themselves from that discussion. All right, so I guess we can take the last questions about this, or are we gonna go on to the operations before?
We can do it either. I mean, usually we do it at the end, but if you feel, if you want to.
I think it's easier once we're because we're talking about these topics.
Sure, that's fine.
Really quickly, right?
Sure, all right. So I'll ask real quick. So if a board has committees, can those committees consist of only one member or who is a member? Like say you're having a committee, I guess, can you have committees be one person?
So I think this is really building specific because committees are defined different ways. There are some buildings that will have a committee head up by a board member that will otherwise take volunteer residents from the building to join in. Maybe you don't want to serve on the board, but you do want to assist with the gardening. So you're on the gardening committee, or you want to be on the building's party planning committee. And, you know, so there are certain buildings that provide for that. There are other buildings that provide for committees that are only made up of boards, directors and members. So it really is a building specific answer.
I think what they're asking is, can a committee be one person?
Oh, I mean, again, building specific, but frankly, I don't think I've ever come across a committee that's
I've never had a committee of one person. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I guess there can always be a first. All right. if the management takes the minutes, don't those minutes have to be reviewed and approved by the board before they're adopted?
Correct. Minutes are usually approved at the following month's board meeting. So your May minutes would be approved by the board in your June's board meeting, and then in those minutes you will put the minutes of May 15th, blah 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 blah, were approved. So yes, you have to record and approve. Record
I
the
think that
approval of
actually
the minutes.
goes for whether the management's taking it or the secretary.
Yeah,
You
even
want to
if the
make sure your
secretary
minutes
takes
are
it.
accurate regardless of who's keeping them. Yeah.
Correct.
Okay. Going back to roles, can you go through a vice president's duties a little bit further?
Sure. So in the general sense, a vice president's duties are really to stand in when the president is not available. That being said, reality, vice president is usually conferred on a lot more than just when the president's not available. And again, very building specific. There are some buildings that do flesh out more of what the vice president is responsible for. But in a general sense, vice presidents are usually there just to fill in the shoes of the president if they're unable to assist.
Got it. All right, where should conflicts of interest be recorded?
Leah, you could advise, but if a conflict of interest arises, there should be a note taken to the side. I've never really had a conflict of interest, to be honest with you, that had to be recorded. So Leah, would you put that in the minutes, or would you just keep a note so that at the end of the year, you know you have to report this?
So a little bit of both, in the sense where you've got that interested broker that's on the board. It's kind of understood that that broker should not be there. When it comes to things like construction contracts, or Amanda, your example of that leak that's affecting the board president's apartment, sometimes I'll see that they'll note in the minutes, we talked about the leak on the 3rd floor. Accordingly, so-and-so was asked to leave as this affects their apartment. And that's just to make sure that there is absolutely no hint of impropriety, that that person was asked to leave. If you wanted to make it obvious with that interested broker, I'm sorry to keep using that as my example, but
I was a former broker, so I'm taking offense.
It comes up more often than not. So that's why I keep turning to it, because it's one that we see a lot.
Mhm.
If you're talking about that application for 8F, you can say, so-and-so is the broker, and so she was asked to leave.
Mhm.
I just think it makes it cleaner, but
Mhm.
that's the lawyer in me. If you don't want to allude to any conflicts in your minutes, then like Amanda said, to take side notes, keep a running list, let management handle it so that when the forms come in and you do need to report, you can come back and say, oh, hey, what about that insurance settlement that you got on your apartment? Or, hey, what about that deal that you threw your cousin in to bid on? Just keep side notes and come back to them. But yeah, I've seen buildings both ways.
Great, thank you.
Elise,
All
I
right.
think we can answer these next 3 questions after we
Sure.
talk about the board operations and the meetings, agendas, and minutes.
Definitely.
And things like that.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So confidentiality. If a shareholder asks a board member how the board voted on an issue, can the board member reveal the outcome of the vote if he or she doesn't reveal the individual positions on the board count, on the vote count?
What do you mean? Okay, if there's 7 members, you can say 5 voted for and 2 voted against.
I guess if you're saying like so-and-so, Sally said no.
You never want to say who voted in what way. Some boards, I have some boards that would put, this was voted for, against, and 4 for and 2 against, or whatever the case is. A lot of the times, though, it is recommended that if a board voted for something, then it should just be said that this was the board's vote. Because when you start going into divulging that, maybe it was one vote away from being a yes or one vote away from being a no, that can cause the resident, the owner, to, really start to become combative and challenge, and then it can cause divide amongst the board and the residents. But I'll let Leah chime in.
I agree. I never, ever, ever encourage my boards to divulge who voted for what. I don't even like when they do counts. You are a board, you are acting as a unified front for your building. You are the be all end all decision maker of your building. So what carries, and what fails. I find that is the cleanest way to go about voting. If you start going into numbers and people, it does cause divisiveness. It might not for that one, do we like the plans for the lobby renovation? Yes or no? Maybe that won't be so harmful. But when you start talking about, should we terminate this person's proprietary lease based on objectionable conduct? That's a different story. And so you kind of don't even want to open up that slippery slope where people start thinking it's okay to divulge how votes went one way or the other. I personally just would rather keep it clean and, the board voted yay or the board voted nay, and keep it that way. Yeah.
So without divulging the count, can a board member discuss whether a motion was voted on?
Well, the answer should be when you vote on something, if it had something to do with a specific, owner or unit or whatever, then you go back to that person and say the board met, they discussed the topic, and it was voted that the answer is yes or the answer is no. And that's it.
And not only that, but assuming it didn't affect one particular apartment, shareholder, et cetera, any big decision would be reflected in the minutes. And of course, all shareholders, unit owners have access to those minutes. So if you're really all that curious about it, you'll see it in the minutes.
Right.
Can you guys go back to the confidentiality part again and elaborate on the point that discussions in board meetings are confidential? Does that mean that topics raised in board meetings cannot be mentioned to shareholders?
So this one's sort of a double-edged sword because most of the topics that are brought to board meetings are topics that are circulating around your building.
Right.
If you're not happy with the new mailroom, everyone's going to be talking about how they don't like the new mailroom. And so the board's going to have to talk about the fact that nobody likes the new mailroom. So it's not a big surprise that these topics are coming to the board. That being said, there are topics that the community at large does not necessarily know about, like someone's in arrears for 6 months, or somebody died and their next of kin is trying to get into the apartment, and what do we do without proper verification? Those types of things have no business being circulated around the building. They're being discussed by a select group of people for a reason. These are the people that were voted onto the board to carry these decisions. They are the representatives of the building as voted on by, a majority of shareholders, unit owners, et cetera. So there is an air of confidentiality that needs to stay in place. If you get people that are constantly calling a board member saying, oh, we really hate that mailroom, you can say, yeah, I know, we're going to talk about it. But things that are brought up that might not necessarily be common knowledge to everyone really should not leave the board meeting. And frankly, once a topic is discussed at a board meeting, I don't really think it should be talked about outside with respect to, I felt one way, Amanda felt another way, and Elise said this. These types of conversations, we want to encourage boards to feel comfortable, to feel open, to share their opinions and not be politicized, to be unedited. And this way you get a real feedback And that's why you have all of these individuals on a board for collective feedback and different points of view. If they're all worried that someone's going to go out and circulate what they said to the rest of the building, they might start editing what they say. They might not participate at all. And so then you really get a constricted view of the board and their participation on these issues.
So how do you advise boards when there's conflict about the degree of detail that they should include in minutes, and some want privacy and others don't? You know, they don't want to foster gossip, I guess, but
I have a lot of conversations with board members where, you know, every once in a while something will get out and okay, you know, things happen, people talk. If it becomes a problem, I think management steps in, or they'll ask me to step in to remind everyone that you are coming into these meetings with an air of confidence, that this is a private matter to be discussed, and that if it were something for the entire board to discuss, for the entire building to discuss, we'd be discussing it at the annual.
Okay.
So we can roll that into the minutes thing here, board operations, because a part of that question was also how much detail to put into your minutes. So we're going into this board operations topic now.
Okay, great.
And that's something that a lot of boards struggle with. I have some boards that like to put every single detail. I have some boards that just like to put you know, like what decisions were made, or what topics were discussed. You have to remember that your minutes are being read by every prospective purchaser, their attorneys. Some banks may request to read the minutes. And you always want to be careful what you're putting in there. And it can become a fine line between something that is, okay, we want to just record it, and something that can potentially get you sued if you're saying too much. So for example, usually when I take minutes, when it gets to the arrears part, I don't usually put in detail which unit's in the person's name, right? I would say that the arrears report was discussed, the appropriate action is being taken where necessary, and leave it like that, right? I have some boards that like to, you know, put every single detail. And then I have some who, you know, would say, we don't need to put the entire discussion around the elevator project. We can just put that the project was discussed. Here is the decision that was made. This is how we're going to move forward, and leave it as that. I will let Leah tell you as an attorney which one she believes is best. I like to err on the side of less is more, because it will potentially lessen your chances as the board or the building of getting sued. And my hat is always in the mind of the board is my client, and I need to make sure that I am protecting their interests so that they don't get sued. But I'll let Leah chime in on this.
I am always the bearer of bad news when it comes to these things, huh? Okay, I wear two different hats. On the purchaser's attorney hat, I want to see as much in the minutes as possible, because I want to know everything that's going on in that building, because I want to tell my client everything they need to know. As corporate counsel, I want to put as little in there as I am able to, so that my building, my client is protected, and nothing they discuss is misinterpreted, is circulated. I think especially now, and I know Amanda and I were going to touch upon this, but now as a result of COVID, minutes are being circulated via email. Some management companies are doing a fantastic job of making things password protected, and you can only access it one time. And others are just emailing you in Word document, and like there's no telling where they're going to go with it. So for that, I think even more now, it's become a prevalent thing where I remind my boards, careful about what you put in. You should address the things that you talk about. But like Amanda said, in a way that is not giving away the back and forth of the conversation. Who voted for what, personal information like arrears, things like that. I have a co-op where we have a mentally disturbed shareholder tenant who continually causes noise disruptions in the building. It is an ongoing topic that we talk about all the time, and yet I don't want their name, their apartment, or even the details of what goes down to be shared, save for the fact that there is a noise disruption on the blah, blah, blah floor, and, you know, the board is taking appropriate action or council was consulted on this. You know, it's for the benefit of the board and the shareholders, unit owners to come back to be able to say, oh yeah, that's when this happened. But at the same time, not give away too much that outsiders that are looking at these things are walking away with far too much information than they should have about personal matters.
Let's also talk about boards who want to put their minutes on like a building site like Building Link, or email them to all of the owners. Because I know I've had boards who ask, well, can we put the minutes on Building? Actually, I've had a board where you're the attorney, Leah, and they wanted to put the actual minutes on Building Link, and they're like, oh, well, it's a PDF, it's fine. And your advice to them was not to put the actual minutes, because although it is a PDF, there are all sorts of things now where you can edit the PDF, and the minutes are an official document of the corporation. And so what this particular board started doing was creating a summary of the minutes to put onto the website, which just included, you know, the decisions that were made on the hot topics that everyone in the building were talking about at the time.
Totally.
And so I know some of the boards have questions like that. There's also, and this is going to answer one of the questions that are in there, your agendas and things that you talk about. Someone in the chat was asking, you know, if a board member has a leak from above, should that be an agenda item on the monthly meeting? My answer would be, would any other shareholder or unit owners leak from above be an agenda item on the for a board meeting? If the answer to that is no, then that can be perceived to someone else looking at the minutes that, wait a minute, hold on, I had a leak. The board didn't have this a discussion about it back in May when I had my leak. Why is it that Sue has a leak, she's on the board, and they're discussing it? And you don't want to put yourself in a position for anyone to be able to say the board is doing anything special because someone is a board member.
Totally. I know we were going to get into preferential treatment as well. It's not, you know, I never like there to be, I'm all for transparency when it comes to, because I know I hear this, and Amanda, I'm sure you do too. If I had $1 for every time we sat at an annual and shareholders got up and said, we want full transparency from our boards. We want to know everything you're talking about. We want to know everything you're working on. And for that reason, I'm all for you putting something up on Building Link to let them know, hey, we are talking about that bum elevator. We are talking about the fact that the lobby's air conditioning sucks. You know, all of those things should be going out to shareholders, and not just at the annual. They all have a right to know that the issues that they share in and are frustrated by or want addressed by the board are being talked about and being considered. I think it's also important to know when their mortgages have been refinanced, and, you know, the fact that their assessment might be dropping off or that an assessment is coming in. Things like that are important for people to know, and I'm all for that. I think where I draw the line is where we get into specific apartments, specific owners, specific personal details, where that really shouldn't be circulated. And that's really where the board needs to draw the line as well. So, all for giving a general overview of what's going on in the building, sort of like if you were writing a newsletter, that's what this should serve. You should all know we're talking about this. You should all know we signed a new contract to redo the lobby and the work's going to start September. All great things to share, but when it comes to, again, individuals, it's not the purpose of Building Link or any other sort of forum. I'm also super against Facebook. At least Building Link is password protected. You have a username, you have a password, it's being monitored by management. Facebook is a community. I'm on it. I have a mom group I'm on. I have a school group I'm on. Great for networking, great for meeting people, not great for sharing building information. Meet neighbors, talk to each other, hang out, all good. But this is not where minutes need to be circulated. This is not where board topics need to be discussed. I have had some really messy situations where board members have gotten onto Facebook pages and dragged other board members based on things that have come out of meetings. That is all just not in the best interest of your building. I don't care what end of the spectrum you stand on. It's not good. It's not promoting the unified front of the board, that even if you can't stand each other and you're on opposite ends of a topic, keep that for the board meeting. That's the point of it. I'm not for these like community spaces where they're all airing everyone's dirty laundry.
I think we can go on to the corporate documents section now. So I'm not sure how much the board know the difference between the documents of a co-op and the documents of a condominium. We might want to start there.
Let's
Leah.
talk about that.
All righty.
So co-ops are not real property. Co-ops are a corporation of which there are many shareholders. When you buy into a corporation or into a co-op, you are not buying an apartment. You are buying shares of a corporation. And in turn, as a result of you buying your shares, you are getting the right to occupy a particular apartment for which those shares are assigned. So you are a shareholder, much like if you went on and bought stock on the stock market, but at the same time, you are now establishing a landlord-tenant relationship with the corporation of which you are a shareholder. So you wear two hats here. While the stock and lease cannot be severed, in other words, you can't sell the stock to someone and the lease to someone else, you can be a shareholder and you get a proprietary lease, which is the right to occupy that particular apartment, and sets forth all of the rules, much like if you were in a rental building and signed a lease agreement. And it gives you all the ins and outs of what you can and cannot do, what you're responsible for, what the corporation's responsible for, and all the rules governing the use of that apartment. But it's also important to note that while you might be a shareholder, the right to occupy that apartment can be taken away if you do not follow the rules of the lease separately. So sorry, I should go back. Your corporate documents for co-ops are your stock certificate, your proprietary lease, and the governing documents of the building are an offering plan, which applies to both co-op and condo, plays out the details of the building at the time that it was constructed or converted from a rental, and then your bylaws and house rules. Proprietary leases and bylaws need to be voted on by shareholders. There's usually a certain percentage if you want to change the terms of those documents. House rules are typically changed by the board because they're an ever-evolving document, and so you don't want to have to call, a full annual meeting to vote on house rules as things sort of evolve. COVID was a perfect example where we would start putting in COVID regulations in the building. You weren't going to call the entire building in the middle of a pandemic to come vote. to hopefully get, 75% or 66 and 2/3%. So house rules are a board decision. Condominiums, by contrast, are real property. So when you buy a condominium apartment, it's like buying a house. It's just that your house is in a bigger building with other little houses inside. You get a deed, and you also get the right to a certain percentage of common interest, which affect the shared spaces of the building, the corridors, the lobby, the elevator shafts, roof, that kind of stuff. So condominiums also have an offering plan. They have a declaration which sets forth the guts of the condominium. It will discern what portions of the apartment are yours and what is a common element. It will also go into the responsibilities of the condominium versus the unit owner and the corporate governance of the building itself. And then you'll have bylaws as well, much like the co-op goes into, the board, how you operate, how you vote, your meetings, etc.
Okay, so while we're on this topic, we can talk about how COVID has changed things. And a lot of your building's governing documents were done in 1980, whatever, or 70, whatever. And so they say things like, one in the comments here that we have, notice must be given only in person or by mail.
I love that.
And that the annual meeting must be in person, and things like that. Now, when COVID hit, of course, the governor, and the different state entities passed provisions that allowed you to bend those rules because they understood that the time doesn't allow for you to do an in-person annual meeting. But what a lot of boards are seeing is that, one, some boards are getting way better turnouts on their annual meeting, doing them via Zoom, than doing them in the lobby of the building or at the community center down the block, because it's more convenient for a lot of people. And so what we have is a lot of boards considering, putting forth bylaws changes to change those antiquated measures that say you can only have an annual meeting in person. They're now putting forth the votes at the annual meeting to change it so that they can meet in person or virtually, or they're changing it to say, notice can be served by mail or by email. And so those are things, because it's written, the question was, is it important to update the bylaw? I would say from a legal standpoint, you want to update it. Because anyone can go back and fight you and say, the bylaws doesn't say that. And I know, I get it. We're all of us in our mind are saying, well, it's 2021. Why would we still do it that way? But it's important to make that change. I mean, Leah, you can chime in as the attorney, but it's important. I think it's important to make that change.
I have to tell you, the influx that I have gotten over the last year and a half to say, it's taken us 20 years, but we are ready and we need you to revise the bylaws, please. It's overwhelming. These are things that I've talked about with my boards over the years and just said, hey, as things come up, and that's usually how it happens, right? Like, there's a leak and we can't discern who's responsible for it. And we think it's this way, but it could be that way. And, as these things happen, you're sort of like, well, we should really revise it to provide XYZ and really lay these kinds of things out. And so what I've been doing was keeping running lists of topics for my boards. And then when COVID hit and they were like, oh my God, we need to do everything virtually. We need to make sure everything's done via email, not just annuals, but board meetings need to be approved to be done virtually. We want to make sure that email is a valid way, or building link is a valid way of circulating notices for things. I then not only sat down to incorporate the virtual aspect of things, but to also attack those inconsistencies in corporate documents that we had been noticing over the years. Because as I said before, sometimes revising these documents take 66 2/3% or 75% approval. If you're going to revise them, do it all in one shot. Get all of the little, kinks out and iron out what you think might be problematic. We're starting to do that on most of my buildings at this point, to clean things up, to modernize them beyond the 1975 form. Some of these things don't even contemplate modern day issues, right? Cogen projects and modernized your documents. So I think it's extremely important, but it is a large undertaking. And when my boards do come to me to do it, I do tell them, try to encompass as much as you can, because the threshold is so high, you'd rather get it all in than keep coming back and keep calling meetings to continue to revise it.
The next topic is financials, budgeting, assessments, arrears process.
That's a loaded one.
It's a loaded one. It is a loaded one. No one likes to really talk about those things. I see that we're getting a lot of questions in the chat, so I think we can go through this one fairly quickly, because it seems as though people have specific concerns and questions. So I'll attack the least complicated one, which is arrears process. I'll take that one. You can have
good.
Okay, so arrears process. It's good for every building to establish a process on addressing arrears. And the reason for establishing a process is so that no one can say that I am being treated differently than another owner because I got a legal letter at 90 days, but that person didn't, hadn't paid for 6 months and they weren't sent to legal. And the process is usually something like the first month rolls around, your due date before late fees is the 15th of the month, give them till about the 20th, no payment came in, manager sends a nice, note or phone call to the owner. Hi, we noticed that we didn't get payment this month. If there was some sort of an error, if there's something you need to discuss, please contact me. Simple. Now, second month rolls around, still no payment from the first month. Second month, still no payment. Then the letter gets a little, escalated. You now, 60 days past due. Please contact our office to discuss this matter as soon as possible. Any further, arrears can result in legal action being taken, and remind them that the cost of such legal action will be billed back to them as the owner. And hopefully by this time they would have made contact and made a payment. But if for some reason that third month rolls around and now we're on the 20th, after the 15th of the third month and there's still no payment, I usually like to send that one last letter that says, if we don't receive payment in the next 5 business days, we will send your account to legal for further action. And then if we don't hear from them by that, whatever that date is, then I will send the ledger and everything that's needed over to whoever handles your arrears, that attorney, and so they can start to put together the demand notice and whatever legal letter that needs to go out. So that's how typically it goes. Now, sometimes you have a building where maybe, arrears really isn't a thing. And now you have, Mr. John, who's never in arrears, and now he's in arrears. And, a month passed, 2 months passed, and being on the board and living in the building, some of you may know, well, I really haven't seen him, maybe something is going on. And there's times when you would want to just find out a little bit more. And if you find out, Mr. John has been in the hospital, sometimes as a board, you don't want to send him to legal. He's not doing well. Or sometimes there's an apartment where, it's on the market, you know, there's an accepted offer or whatever the case is. So you don't necessarily want to start a legal action because you know they're going to close and you're going to get your money at closing. And those are different, you know, scenarios that can come up. But at least you should have a general, what is the word? I'm sorry. A general
Strategy?
Threshold.
right, threshold as to how you're going to deal with arrears in general. Leah, you can chime in.
You explained it beautifully. I was also going to say that, you know, things like COVID come up, people lose jobs, you know, you don't want to be the one that's, you know, chasing people down because they haven't paid rent or they haven't paid maintenance for a couple months, given the state of everything that's going on. Not that you'd be able to evict anybody anyway, but so yeah, it's difficult, and it is always viewed, I think, on a case-by-case basis, but it is important to have a general threshold so that everyone is treated equally unless there are extenuating circumstances. I know you wanted me to swing into financials and budgeting and assessments and all that fun stuff. Financials. Okay, so it is the treasurer's job to communicate everything to the board, to let you know what kind of financial health the building's in, to keep tabs on the money, and then to present things to the board such that when you start contemplating capital projects, capital improvements, or undertakings, that you know how much you have, you know how much you can afford, you know how to delegate certain amounts of money towards these different types of projects, and how to prioritize what it is that you're looking to accomplish that year. So you create a budget. And so the budget will not only contemplate the projects that you plan on taking on, but also real estate taxes in the event of a co-op, service contracts, your employees, your staff, your professionals, how much you anticipate on spending on all of these categories. And so usually the budget, Amanda, correct me if I'm wrong, but like usually the budget is typically determined, at least 75 to 90% of the budget is basically predetermined. And the rest is sort of supplemented by, you know, your wish list of what you'd like to do in the building, depending on how much money you've got in the bank to do it.
So the majority of the budget are items that are non-discretionary. So it's your taxes, your payroll, your fuel costs, insurance, those things. Just to explain, any capital projects, which are considered like the wish list of things, are below the line on your budget. So for example, if you want to do a lobby renovation, that is a line item that is below the line. It's not calculated in your increase. If there is one that's needed, it's usually a line item that does not affect, you know, whether or not your maintenance or common charges go up. Now you may need to put in an assessment to pay for that below the line item.
Oh, I was getting to assessment.
Yeah, but those things are usually below the line. But yes, the budget are usually items that you really can't control. And we all know you can't control taxes, and many of the budgets are the biggest item is your taxes and your debt service are the biggest items.
So if you, as a building, determine that you have certain expenses that need to be, let's say the boiler absolutely needs to be replaced, you don't necessarily have the money for it, you can impose an assessment to recapture the funds that you need for that project. Similarly, like Amanda said, those below the line items like a lobby renovation, if there's such building demand for it that you need to do it, you know you need to do it, but you just don't have all of the funds readily available, you might impose an assessment to recapture a portion of it, all of it, to make sure that you have the funds and still maintain a balanced budget and good financial health for the building.
Yeah. Let's talk about notice to residents for an assessment, because that's a hot thing for a lot of the boards.
Always a good
And that's
time.
something that a lot of boards struggle with. And of course, everyone wants to let the owners of the building know of an assessment with as much time in advance as possible.
Absolutely.
Sometimes it doesn't work out that way. I usually say you want to give at least 30 days notice of an assessment. And also, when we're speaking of implementing assessments, I want to make it very clear that some of your governing documents may require you to get approval from your unit owners or shareholders for certain amounts. So you have to really be careful and look at your governing documents when you're looking to do these assessments. For example, I had a condo where anything over $100,000 per year needs to be approved. So you need to pay attention to that as well. And I think that wraps up this section. I know there's a lot of questions in the question and answer. We have one more slide we want to get through, and then we're going to power through your questions. So working successfully as a board. I think I speak for everyone here, Leah and Elise, when we say that the goal as a board is to be able to work coherently, as peacefully as possible, to present a united front, to be compromising, and not to have conflict within the board. To work successfully as a board, I think, and this is my opinion, everyone has to be able to, at some point, agree to disagree, put their personal feeling aside, and say, what does the building need, and vote in accordance to what the building needs. There also has to be a mutual respect amongst all board members. You do not have to like them enough to have to go to their house or spend the weekend with them away and have drinks with them or invite them to Sunday dinner or brunch. But you should have a mutual respect for one another to where when there's a discussion going on, you can allow a person to finish their thought, articulate themselves, and then you speak. And if someone else has an opinion, you can allow them to voice their opinion without belittling or, being condescending, and try to understand the different perspectives. The outcome is always, and the focus should always be, what is in the best interest of our building, even if I don't like it. And that's my advice on, how to really be successful as a board. Now I'm going to speak from a management standpoint. To be successful as a board, you as a board, you have the authority to vote and do. I'm going to say whatever you want, but not really whatever you want, but you have that authority. You hire management to guide you and to help you with that day-to-day running of your board. Let us guide you. If we're telling you something, it's usually for a reason and a good one. And our job, me as a manager, I like to tell my boards the pros and the cons. I like to say, sure, you can do that, but if you do that, this is what may happen. If you do this, this is what may happen. You all wouldn't always like what we say as a manager, but we're looking at it from outside. You're in it and invested in it and are emotional about it. Not to say that we're not feeling the emotion and we don't care as much as you do, but we are a set of eyes that are separate from this situation on a daily basis. And so we often can see things that you may not be able to see in that moment. Leah, what do you have?
I'm just going to jump in and say, same goes for counsel, because there are plenty. First, I'll back up and say, please call your counsel when you have questions about things. Don't make a decision and then call your counsel 3 months later and say, well, we did this, that, and the other thing, and it hasn't worked, so get us out of it. No, counsel is not supposed to be prohibitive. We're here to help you. We're here to walk through issues with you. We're here for management, to help them in helping to guide you. Amanda and I work on a few buildings together, and I talk to her regularly, and I find that those buildings are the ones that I don't want to say do better, but I just have a clearer idea of how they want to proceed, because they've contemplated, well, what does counsel think? How might this get us in trouble? How might this play out? What am I missing here? And I think that's where your professionals and your management company come into play as being your support. That's what we're here for. That's why you hire us. That's hopefully why you like us. But it's an important relationship to have. You should feel, I give my board members have my cell phone. You can text me. I don't care. I will answer you all times of the day. And if I don't know the answer, I will genuinely tell you I don't know the answer, and I will get back to you. But it's supposed to be a relationship where you trust us to help lead you in the right direction. This is our livelihood. For you, it's a volunteer position. We don't expect you to have all of the answers. We don't always have all of the answers, but together we work to guide you on the right path. So please call counsel, please call management, please call your CPA, and please listen when we tell you something, because it's I think going to make everyone's lives easier if you do. And I think we do this because we enjoy the profession, because we know a bit about the profession, and based on our experiences, we can help you make your decisions for your building.
Yeah. Okay, so now discrimination and preferential treatment. When we talk about discrimination, this can come up in many different ways. One of the things I like to remind my board is when you get those requests from a shareholder or unit owner that is asking for you to approve something that is usually, excuse me, that is usually, not allowed in the building, or you have a rule of a maximum of 5 years of subletting, and you allow that someone that 6th year due to a circumstance. And I always say to my boards when they're discussing these one-off requests, I always say, please be mindful of the decision you are making now, because if someone else makes the same request, you will have to consider it, if not say yes, because if you say yes to this at this time, because if you don't, then you leave yourself in a position for someone to say, well, okay, you allowed that person to do it, but you're not allowing me to do it. So we're being treated differently. That person was given preferential treatment. Am I now being discriminated upon? And while discrimination may not have been anywhere in your mind, that can happen. You also want to be very careful when board members are involved. You don't want to allow a board member to do something like put in a skylight if you're not ready to allow everyone else who has, access to putting in a skylight to be able to put in a skylight. Right. But Leah, you can.
I think you summed it up beautifully.
Okay. We'll touch on chain of command, and this one is really quick. Sometimes we have board members who like to go to staff members directly and tell them what to do. Sometimes we have staff members who like skip the super and like to go to the board and voice their complaint or, you know, their dissatisfaction or whatever it may be. I always tell my boards if there is a chain of command, and how that goes is the staff, building staff reports to the super reports to the manager then brings to the board any items that they cannot handle or need board input or board decision. If a staff member comes directly to a board member, and we get that it happens because you guys are at the building and you form that bond and that relationship, what I always encourage my board members to do is to say to that staff member, please have you said this to whoever the super is? Have you brought it to their attention? If the answer is no, please go to Joe and speak with him about it. If you don't get the answer, a solution, then please go to the management. And then if you don't, then you can come back to us. But these are the steps that need to be followed first before it's brought to the board. And I do the same thing with my building staff. Sometimes I have building staff who come directly to me and they, want something. I'm like, okay, well, did you ask the super? No, I didn't go through the super. Well, that's where you need to go first. And then we will follow the steps. Now, of course, if it's something that's, extremely urgent, we're not going to just shoo them away. But we want to try to follow that chain of command. We want to make sure that the super feels empowered to run his staff and run the building. So we don't want to bypass the super and start micromanaging his staff. If there is something wrong, we want to, you say to the manager as a board member, hey, Amanda, I noticed that the guys haven't been vacuuming the hallways. What's going on with that? And then I can say, okay, let me go talk to Joe and see, talk to him and see what's happening and see what's going on. And that's what we encourage in terms of the chain of command. I think we talked about decisions, compromising, and united front as a board already.
Yeah.
Being a good example as a representative is very self-explanatory. You cannot be on the board and have your music blasting at 12 a.m.
Yes.
If the house rule says that your music should not be blasting after 10 p.m. You cannot be on the board if you have a mask rule for all common areas and you're the one not wearing the mask in the lobby. You have to lead by example. Removal of a director or an officer. Sometimes you have that one board member who, it doesn't happen a lot, but sometimes it happens. You have that one board member who is disruptive, or that one board member who never follows the building rules. I will let Leah talk about the removal.
I'm telling you, you're giving me all the good ones tonight.
Said disruptive board member, if that needs to happen.
So, again, building rules differ from building to building. That being said, you can remove, typically, you can remove an officer from a position and still keep them on as a director or a manager. But you could, in other words, if the president is just so blatantly disrespecting or over abusing their power as president, you can demote them to a director, a board member, and leave them not as president, but still on the board. Then there is removal off the board entirely. It's usually for cause. It usually requires a meeting. Sometimes it will require participation of the entire building. Sometimes it'll just require a vote of the board itself. Entirely building specific. And if you're going to have cause, you better damn well have good cause, because if you're going to start that sort of an action, it's obviously something that's taken very personally. It obviously can cause a lot of discourse in your board. And since we're all about united fronts here, it better be for a very good reason and not just, sour grapes because you didn't like the way a vote went a week ago.
Yeah. And last but not least, before we go to Q&A, working with the sponsor, the entity that everyone loves.
So I'll take it because I do a lot of conversion work. So I have been on sponsor side and I have been on board side. I think for those that have sponsors in their building, you are most successful when you work harmoniously with the sponsor. It's like Amanda said about your fellow board members. You don't need to have them over for brunch. You don't need to plan a family vacation with them. If they still have apartments in the building, chances are they're entitled to a seat on your board. You can't oust them. You can't try to remove them. They have the right to be there. You need to honor that, respect that. Yes, their viewpoints might be different from yours. They might be looking at it from a rental perspective. You're looking at it as a residence perspective. They do often conflict. But if you can all come to terms with the idea of a better building is better for everybody, then, you know, try to work as civilly with your sponsor as you possibly can. What else did I want to say there? Sponsors, like I said, sometimes they're entitled to seats on the board. They can appoint whoever they want. They can change their representative whenever they want. You have no say over that. There are, and again, totally building dependent, but sometimes sponsors are allowed to use their votes to vote for other people on the board. And sometimes they are only relegated to their one seat on the board. So that depends building to building, and it all depends on how your bylaws are written. And that's also something that a lot of people like to talk about when we revise bylaws, is to make clear whether or not a sponsor can vote their shares for other seats on the board. Nominations are something that they are limited to, but you know, if they like the president and want to give all their votes to the president to keep the president on the board, they can do that in some cases. So yeah, I think just, you know, coming to terms on working on a whole together. It's all part of the same message we've been sharing about working together and creating a united front. I think that includes sponsor.
All right, at least we can go to the questions now.
Yeah, so I just want to first of all say you guys have been so informative. This, I think, should be a two-part series. So, and I'm sure people will agree. And I don't even know if we'll be able to answer all the questions this evening because there are a lot. So again, if there are questions that we are not able to answer right now, please, you'll get all of our information at the end. If you think of something tomorrow in the middle of the night, just please send them to Amanda and Leah. They clearly have a strong prowess in this and we'll be happy to answer you after tonight. So let's get to it. So say there's a problem when the interest of the board is in conflict with the interest of the shareholders. What do you recommend in that case?
Well, the interest of the board or the interest of the building? Because if the interest of the building is A, but you know the shareholders won't like it, and or you know the majority, for example, the interest of the building is you need an assessment for $1 million, but the demographic in your building is such that maybe you have a high population of fixed income elderly people. So that $1 million assessment is probably not the best interest of your shareholders or your unit owners because it's going to really affect their pocket. The interest of the building is what the board should be focusing on, and that $1 million assessment should be implemented in order to do whatever it is that needs to be done in the building. I hope that I got your question correctly and that answered it.
Yeah, no, that's great. I mean, I think basing it up, there was another question regarding that. How do you recommend encouraging self-interested board members to stop steering directions or discussions about their personal priorities or their unit concerns? Because the biggest shareholders are on the board and they insist on focusing on their concerns. So it's making it feel like they're working for particular people instead of their building, which they believe is their fiduciary obligation.
How can you stop a self-serving board member from being self-serving?
You remove them?
I don't know if you can stop them. That's the honest answer. But what has to be done is, in my opinion, is that the rest of the board needs to be able to say to that person, and listen, when you're on a board, you have to not be afraid to speak up. Because if you sit back and let that one self-serving board member drive everything, because that's what usually happens, right? That person is usually the loudest and the most passionate. And so at some point, everyone else gets tired and just goes, you know what, I can't. But then that's not in the best interest of the building. And so the rest of the board needs to be able to say, okay, Joe, we know that this is what you want, but can we talk about what the building needs at this time? I can't guarantee you that you're going to get Joe to stop just only thinking about what he wants. But you guys need to continue to steer it back to, it's not about you, it's about the building. So this is what we need for the building. And if push comes to shove, sometimes you just have to say, let's vote. Because Joe isn't going to let it go.
Right.
What his position is. And sometimes you just need to say, all right, let's put it to a vote.
Put it to a vote. Yep. Agreed.
So speaking of that, can serving on a co-op board be subject to a term limit? So can serving as the president of co-op be served at, ended at a certain time, or is it indefinite?
Check your board documents. Check your documents. And if you want them, that's something you can consider when you're revising bylaws.
Yeah. It would have to be in your governing documents in order to be able to do that.
Okay. Yeah. So you guys are speaking about social media and using Facebook as a place that you don't recommend for boards to air their grievances or potentially even have a Facebook page for the building. Is there any way a board can restrict an owner's use of social media as a way to, criticize the board's efforts?
I had this, and the answer is no, but. No, because it's freedom of speech. We can't limit someone's right to express their opinions. Facebook is a means of doing that. Yeah, but if you are using it to drag a board member through the mud or make accusations of a board member's self-dealing or a board member's impropriety or the way a board member voted on a certain topic or talked about a certain topic. I even had one board where they were putting up caricatures of a board member stealing money from a condominium. It's unbelievable what some people will do when they are incensed about a topic. The best I can say is that slander and libel are lawsuits for a reason.
All right, good answer. Thank you.
Sure.
Which building document in a condo defines common elements like water branch lines and a bathroom? And is that a unit owner or board responsibility to replace and repair?
I can't answer whose responsibility it is to replace because it depends entirely on your building's documents, but you should look at your declaration for that answer.
Thank you. All right, if a shareholder makes an anonymous complaint, for example, regarding noise and dog barking, does it matter to the board who specifically is making the complaint, or should it be, if someone is saying they want to be anonymous, should that be respected?
So I think generally an anonymous complaint is always respected, but if it becomes a problem, a repetitive issue where we might need to go to court about that issue, then I would try to encourage the person that complains to come forward to identify themselves, because we may need you. We may need you to prepare an affidavit. We may need you to appear in court. We may need you to go on the record to some extent about what it is that you're hearing, witnessing, seeing, etc. But initially, just to get us to stop the dog from barking, anonymous is fine.
Can you we discuss about sponsors? Do sponsors need to announce the name of an appointee to the board?
Sponsors, I think, need to provide the information so that management is able to contact them and the board is able to communicate with them. Beyond that, does there need to be a big announcement to the building? Not necessarily, but they're going to be responsible to amend the offering plan. And on the offering plan, on the amendment, they have to give a list of board members. So they would need to include their representative on there as well.
Okay. Should house rules be amended to add a provision about reasonable accommodation with to people with disabilities?
Oh, so the ADA governs a lot, and if you're doing certain capital improvement projects to the building, you're going to need to ensure that you are ADA compliant. For those types of things, I don't necessarily think you need to have it in your governing documents. I think the ADA will control there. But if you are concerned or you want to reserve a certain elevator, or make sure that a certain ramp is kept clear of debris or people hanging out on it, then yeah, certainly put that in your house rules.
Great. This is I used to get this all the time. What happens to all the personal information provided to the board to get approved for purchase? Where is it stored and who has access to it?
So in terms, from a management standpoint, the application that comes in, we create what's called a tenant file, and it goes into the tenant file. Who has access to it? The manager of the building. No one outside can come and say, hey, I want to see what's in, in that file. Of course, the board sees the entire application because they review it. But that's the extent of who's able to see that information and what happens to it.
Okay, thank you. What about 5-day letters? It was my understanding if you want to go after someone who hasn't paid in, say, 6 months, you will not be able to collect unless you can show a 5-day letter has been sent every month.
That's probably a building specific requirement. I haven't heard of a 5-day notice on the regular anyway. No.
Got it.
I've heard of, you have to, the building council, before we can go to court and try to get any liens or anything like that, we have to serve the demand, which it gives 5 days.
Right.
But it's not done monthly.
Yeah.
And I think this is a really good one to end on because it's positive. And then please, anyone who has, any questions after this, we're going to give you our contact information and we're going to do part 2. So hold on to your hats. All right. What are some techniques to improve the efficiency of a board in terms of A, delegation within the board to reduce the number of decisions made by the board as a whole, and then B, use of digital tools ranging from Google Docs to survey tools or Slack to facilitate communication, voting, and document creation?
Okay.
That was like a Jeopardy question. I can also repeat. You can say, can you please ask again?
Actually, this is my board member. So
well, that needs to remains anonymous.
Okay. So I do have some boards that would say, listen, we don't want to see, the whole board doesn't want to see every single thing that needs to make a decision. It is okay for, if it's a decision about a purchase application, here's this group of people, they would make that decision. If it's a decision about, a management related something, or, some emergency expense or something that needs to be decided, here is this group, we give them the authority to make the decision that's in the best interest of the building, of course, with reporting back to the entire board at the board meeting. It might be that if it's a repair that needs to be made, maybe you have someone who is in that business or an architect or something on the board. So you want to include that person plus the president and maybe another, person to make those decisions. There was a B part, hold on, to this question. I want to make sure, sure I get all the parts. So that way, you don't necessarily have to, send an email to 7 people and now you're hunting down 7 people to kind of chime in. Leah, what do you say about that portion? Leah is saying that it really should be the majority of the entire board to make the decision.
Thank you. It should.
That is what Leah is saying.
You should try to get as much input as you possibly can. I was actually looking at all of the importing comments about the Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Action. Guys, it doesn't apply to co-ops anymore.
Yeah. So the second
don't worry
part
about
of
your
that,
your 5-day rule. Sorry, I was skipping ahead.
The second part of that is the use of digital tools like Google Docs or survey tools or Slack for communication and voting. The thing about that is that is an additional tool for your manager to have to track. Now, if the board would like to use that tool, track, and then someone reports back to management, that would be easier in terms of, and I'm going to speak to you honestly from a management standpoint, because there's a lot of, different areas and things to keep up with. That would be easier. But if there are some boards who use Slack and they find it easier to use Slack and to put together everything. I do have some boards that internally within the board, they use Google Docs amongst themselves, or like Google Chat amongst themselves to kind of get everything together. And then they report back to us and say, okay, we discussed this is the answer for voting, or, creating documents. Those are really good things. I think that it would please Leah from a legal standpoint if you create these subcommittees. Would it be better if they created these subcommittees, if it's a board of 7, if there's at least 4 people and everyone has to vote for in order for it to go through?
Agreed.
Then that would be better from a legal official standpoint, because then you would have had a vote from the majority of the board. I hope that answers your question, Doug. We can talk about it more if I didn't.
That was great. Well, thank you. And I really, really appreciate your time tonight, Leah and Amanda. You both have been phenomenal. Again, we definitely need you to come back for part 2, because I'm sure there are so many questions that people have that are still brewing. So Amanda, you have to, I guess, hold on a little longer. We
can do part 2 in about 2 or 3 months.
Okay, so we'll have to pencil you in. We'll pencil you in. You both have been amazing. Thank you for your time. Leah Bloomberg from MMP Ads, Amanda Smith, our very own. Thank you all, and thanks for attending tonight. Have a wonderful night. Stay healthy, and see you soon. Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.